Hello, everyone. I'm Yadvinder Mali, the president of the British Ecological Society, the largest scientific society for ecologists in Europe. Thank you for joining us at our event today to launch the new BES report looking into protected areas and nature recovery. We are currently facing immense environmental challenges at a global scale. However, we do also have a unique window of opportunity to take steps to address these if we can act quickly enough. There's a pressing need to halt and reverse the precipitous declines in biodiversity worldwide, which will be a key focus of the upcoming Conference of the Parties of the Convention of Biological Diversity, or COP15, and the post-2020 biodiversity framework. Aligned with these international ambitions, the UK Prime Minister has pledged to meet the Convention of Biological Diversity target and boost biodiversity by protecting 30% of UK land and seas by 2030. So it is clear that the next 8 years will be critical for nature in how we progress towards achieving these biodiversity targets. Protected areas are a key tool for tackling biodiversity decline, and the network of protected areas in the UK has the potential to be a real asset in helping nature recover. However, as you will hear today, area-based conservation must be implemented and managed effectively to deliver true gains for nature. Protected areas are subject to pressures both inside and outside their boundaries, as they do not exist in isolation, and the persistence of these pressures can prevent these areas from delivering positive outcomes for nature. Managing the wider environmental pressures, as well as proactively engaging with people, communities, and businesses who live and work in these areas to demonstrate the value and importance of nature, must be a key step to building a more sustainable and nature-positive future. Due to the complexity of this topic, the critical value of ecological evidence in the discussion of protected areas targets, and the urgent need for action, the BES brought together a group of researchers supported by contributions from experts from across the UK nations to produce this report. As you will hear, the report itself analyses the state of UK protected areas, the wide range of benefits they provide to nature and people, and how their effectiveness can be improved to support nature's recovery on land and in the sea. It also discusses which terrestrial and marine-based conservation approaches, including both protected areas and other affected area-based conservation measures, should count for the government's pledge to conserve 30% of UK land and sea by 2030. So thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Damien Carrington to run through how the event will run and to introduce the speakers. Thank you, Damien.
Thank you very much, Yadvinder. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Damien Carrington. I'm the Environment Editor of The Guardian, and I can bring you some breaking news that our story about the BES report is currently the 6th most read story on the entire Guardian website, which, given the news agenda being pretty busy at the moment, shows just how much interest there is in protecting nature. And as Yadvinder pointed out, we're in crisis, but the exciting thing about this report is that there are opportunities within the UK, which we will learn more about shortly. So I need to do a little bit of housekeeping, just to remind you all that the session's being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. There are also live captions or subtitles available. Should you wish to have those, you can turn those on and off at the bottom of the screen. If you click on the more 3 dots there, you'll get through to the subtitles that way. Really importantly, you can all ask questions using the Q&A function, which again you can find down at the bottom of your screen. Please answer the questions as we go along. We've got plenty of time at the end to get through as many as we can. Don't be shy. If you can give your name and your affiliation, that would be helpful. And also, if your question is directed at a particular one of our speakers, please mention that. Also very exciting is there's a voting function on the Q&A. So if you see a question that you think that's a really good question, you can vote for it, and that will highlight it in that Q&A section and give us more of a chance to get to it. So we have 4 speakers, all authors of the report. I'll introduce them one by one, and we're going to start with the lead author of the report, who is Dr. Joseph Bailey. from York St John University, who's going to give us an overview and talk a bit about the policy context. So I'll hand over to you now, Joseph. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much to Yadvinder and Damien, and hello to everyone else. Now, protected areas, they have the potential to be the beating heart of our approach to nature recovery in the UK. And the next several years will be absolutely crucial, given widespread changes in the environment. Having healthy and resilient ecosystems benefits society, as well as the species and habitats that many of us care about. And it's for this reason that we welcome the government's ambition to protect 30% of land and seas for nature by 2030, which is in line with international efforts that the UK helped lead and widely known as 30 by 30. In response to this target, as Yadvinder was just saying, a team of us has collated ecological evidence on the state of UK conservation from published academic and non-academic literature, and through engaging with around 40 experts and stakeholders from conservation charities, non-governmental organisations, and research institutions, as well as individual landowners. We've addressed the different types of designated sites in the UK, their societal and ecological benefits, their ecological state, their role as part of the wider ecological network, and we've considered how their effectiveness as conservation sites can be improved. We've answered 8 key questions around these topic areas as best we can, identifying evidence gaps and making specific UK policy recommendations. A key product of our report is a set of 4 criteria, what we've called our ABCD criteria. These determine whether a terrestrial or marine site is or is likely to be effectively conserving nature and, therefore, whether it should be counted towards 30 by 30, and more on our criteria shortly. The 30 by 30 commitment is a huge opportunity and could provide the catalyst that revitalizes the contribution of protected areas to nature's recovery for 2030 and beyond. However, it's no small task, and this ambition will fail to meet its primary goal of supporting nature's recovery if we don't put in place the substantial transformative changes that are needed to ensure that protected areas not only exist on maps, but deliver for nature in reality. Ultimately, this means taking nature conservation and protected areas seriously. For example, by minimizing or removing pressures and threats from both inside and outside their borders. And we also need to remember that protected areas themselves are not isolated. Instead, they exist as part of a much larger network. These spaces in between protected areas have to be working towards the same long-term goals to ensure nature's recovery. This means having effective environmental policies across all the land and seas. In the UK, protected areas include statutory and non-statutory protected sites and protected landscapes. Protected sites include designations such as marine conservation zones, sites of special scientific interest or SSSIs, and national nature reserves. Protected landscapes include national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty or AONBs, and national scenic areas. Around 28% of land and 38% of seas are designated in the UK, but these areas do not always deliver for nature, with many protected areas falling short of their conservation objectives due to under-resourcing and pressures on biodiversity. Protected landscapes, like national parks, were not designated primarily for biodiversity, so a repurposing is required for them to be included in 30 by 30. This in itself will require substantial and sustained resourcing to ensure they deliver for nature in the long term, many decades into the future. Such a reform could in fact be one of the most positive outcomes of 30 by 30. Along with protected areas, there is also the new concept of other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs, which we think can make a very meaningful contribution to 30 by 30. These could work really well alongside existing designations to bolster biodiversity protection outside protected areas. OECMs could include sites with long-term biodiversity benefits, but with some other primary purpose, such as protecting a cultural site or geological feature, for example. More to come on OECMs. I'll now hand over to some of the other authors to go into a little bit more detail about a lot of the things I just introduced there. So I'll pass back to you then, Damien. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Yeah, thanks very much, Joseph. That's a fantastic introduction. And next we're going to hear about nature recovery on land, and we're going to hear about that from Professor Jane Hill, who is at the University of York and, of course, was an author of the report. So I'll hand over to you now, Jane.
Thanks very much, Damien. I'm just going to share some slides. So hello everyone. Yeah, I'm Jane Hill from the University of York, one of the co-authors on this report. I'd just like to say what a pleasure it was working with everyone to produce such an important report. So it's great to see that the importance of nature recovery is being recognised by the government in their 30 by 30 commitment. And what I'm going to do is cover some of the key messages from the BES policy report from the perspective of terrestrial biodiversity and protected areas and nature recovery on land. So as Joe's already said, the report finds out that as much as 20% of UK land could be protected under some form of designation, but a recent paper found that there was evidence that only about 5% of UK land is effective in nature recovery. So this commitment by the government of 30 by 30 is a fantastic recognition of the importance that nature plays in the role of enhancing people's lives. But it's not just about the amount of land that it's protected, and simply allocating land as being protected is not going to be sufficient. So these areas need management and governance to ensure nature recovery. So a key message from the report is that it's about quality, not just about the quantity of the protected areas. And of course, in many places, leaving nature to recover by itself can be very successful, but many species and habitats need help. And so this new report from the BES very much echoes messages from the Lawton Making Space for Nature report from 2010 about more, bigger, better and connected. And what I've shown there is an example of an absolutely fantastic nature reserve in Rough Bank in the Cotswolds. It's a 10-hectare reserve managed by Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust and Butterfly Conservation. And if you go there, you can see about half of UK butterfly species. So evidence that nature reserves can be hugely successful. So moving on to think a little bit more about the effectiveness of protected areas. And so this is a key message from the report about them having to be effective. So this is going to require resources for monitoring and for management, and also an agreement on what success is going to look like. So thinking about targets and objectives. And the report highlights on how important it's going to be on agreeing on what those objectives are, and also having baseline and regular monitoring to assess progress towards those objectives. Of course, it also raises important questions about baselines, about what's going to be assessed against, who agrees those baselines, and also recognising that no size fits all, and that those targets and objectives will be different for different areas. So I want to move on to think about another message from the report about evidence for the benefit of protected areas. So the BES report finds limited data and limited evidence on the benefits of protected areas. So stresses the importance of protected areas, but they need to be better. So there's evidence that only about half of the current sites are in a favourable state. And of course, the UK has an amazing history of monitoring. Citizen scientists and the general public love recording nature. And so we have a lot of information on changes in biodiversity in the UK going back to the 1970s, for example. And these monitoring programmes are hugely informative, like the Breeding Boat Survey, National Bat Monitoring Programme, Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, for example. But these weren't set up to assess the effectiveness of protected areas. So more information is needed. But the report does find some benefits of protected areas and how they benefit species richness and abundance, but very often those benefits are negligible and the positive benefits are not strong. So moving on to another key message is about the role of protected areas within networks. So the report emphasises that protected areas need to be considered within the wider landscape, and they'll have more benefits if they're part of a resilient network. So these two diagrams here are taken from the report, emphasising that protected areas don't necessarily need to be physically connected. They can still operate as a network if they are functionally connected. And so this highlights that the spaces in between the protected areas are important as well, so that species can move between protected areas, and these spaces in between don't form barriers. The report also says that we have a lot of existing methods already, spatial modelling and so on, to be able to take a landscape scale approach and select the best sites to protect and to manage. And of course, when we're thinking about connectivity, it's recognising that nature is dynamic and that climate change is resulting in species shifting their ranges, recognising how dynamic nature is. And of course, the static protected area network can facilitate range shifting. The types and numbers of species at sites we want to boost, but the types of species and which species are actually there are likely to change over time as communities are reshuffled by climate change. But helping to facilitate those range shifts is important through these connected networks. And so finally, I want to emphasise another key message from the report about inclusivity and also say something about optimism. So the report recognises the importance of nature and green spaces for people. Nature benefits everyone, and everyone should benefit from nature. So the decisions about what to protect and where to protect need to be inclusive, with support from local people, landowners, conservationists and researchers, and so on. And we need to use an evidence-based approach to ensure that conservation is successful. And we've done this, there's examples in the literature of this with successful introductions and translocations of species and so on. I guess a more difficult question is who decides what to introduce and which species and where. Just like to say something about how we do know that we can successfully restore sites. So this is an example I've given here of a successfully restored site on Anglesey, managed by RSPB. Absolutely fantastic wildlife site. And there's many examples in my neck of the woods here in Yorkshire of ex-mining sites, ex-quarries and so on, that have been successfully restored or new habitats recreated where nature is thriving and are absolutely fantastic nature reserves. So one example near me, for instance, is North Cave Wetland near the Humber, which was an ex-quarry that Yorkshire Wildlife Trust took over in 2001, and where nature is now currently thriving with bitterns and avocets and lots of fantastic wetland species. And then finally here, just pointing out that we need to integrate initiatives so that there are win-wins from different government initiatives, like say nature-based solutions, for example, for carbon offsetting, also have benefits for biodiversity. So just to finish with my key messages in terms of nature recovery on land. So the commitment of 30 by 30 is fantastic, and now it needs to deliver for nature. So that involves management and monitoring and operating at landscape scales, and inclusivity, recognising that nature benefits everyone and is for everyone. So protected areas are important, but they need to be better. And so I guess the 30 by 30 recognises the more component, and then there's the bigger, better and connected from the Lawton mantra. So I'll leave it there and hand back to you, Damien. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that. Fascinating stuff, and good to show some of the positive examples. I'm glad that people have started asking questions. And actually, Jane, if you don't mind just staying on the line, as it were, for a moment, there's one that's come from Henry Crick, which we may as well address right now. I think a good question. So he asked whether 10-hectare nature reserves are just too small to be sustainable unless they're part of a network of closely linked sites. That's from Humphrey Crick from Natural England. So if you could take that, Jane, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So benefits of protected areas are going to be much greater if they're in a functioning network, and that particular reserve that I mentioned there is part of a network of sites, which probably is partly to explain why it is so successful. So yeah, coming back to the Lawton, more, bigger, better and connected. So small reserves can be fantastic, but bigger and connected is better.
Thank you very much, Jane. James, I've seen your questions as well, but we'll come back to those because we need to hear from our authors. Next we're going to see, and taking us on that voyage, is Professor Rick Stafford, who's from the University of Bournemouth, who'll talk about UK marine protected areas. So I will hand over to you now, Rick. Thank you very much. And yeah, everyone, just keep asking your questions and we'll get to them. Thank you. Over to you, Rick.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen as well. So yeah, hopefully everybody can see that. Yes, I'm going to talk about marine protected areas. And the sort of headline figure, I guess, is that 38% of UK waters are already designated as MPAs, these places on the map. So in theory, this could be a really short talk, and yeah, this could be a really short talk. I could be handing back to Damien right away, but obviously they're not all performing perhaps as well as they could be. And I think if you think about what should be happening or what you'd expect to happen in marine protected areas, lots of people think that fishing should be banned. And we'll come to that. It doesn't necessarily need to be banned in all marine protected areas. But at the moment, only 0.0024% of UK waters ban fishing. It's the three places which are the red dots on the map. But probably more importantly than that, lots of the other reserves actually have no management measures in place. There was an announcement last week that actually the first 4 English offshore protected areas will have management measures coming in from June. That's only 4 of the many marine protected areas in English waters. The inshore situation is a little bit better. There are more management measures, but there's still quite a lot missing. And also within marine protected areas, we lack monitoring data. So we don't actually know how these areas are performing. So it's very hard to say if they are delivering for nature at the moment or not. So fishing is one pressure. Fishing, probably we need to stop some damaging activities certainly happening in marine protected areas, but we don't always have to ban fishing, and we shouldn't necessarily think of fishing as the only thing we need to protect within protected areas. What we really need to do is to manage for nature, but with the local community. So I'm going to give you an example of Poole Harbour. It's just down the road from me. It's the second largest natural harbour in the world, although if you're an estate agent in the area, it's the biggest natural harbour in the world. It's got multiple protected area designations, including being a SSSI, but it's home to a clam and cockle fishery. That fishery has historically had a lot of overfishing and a lot of illegal fishing going on as well. But this has changed in recent years, and it's changed as a result of a multi-stakeholder partnership. So that's included the Poole and District Fishermen's Association, so it's had the local fishers directly involved, Dorset Wildlife Trust, Seafish, who are a seafood industry representative, and the Southern IFCA, the Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authorities. And the Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authorities have done a lot of work for regulating fishing activities in inshore marine protected areas. But Poole Harbour has been, the fishery in Poole Harbour has been transformed. It's now a Marine Stewardship Council certified as sustainable fishery, and the fishers themselves are also certified under the Seafish Responsible Fishing Scheme. The profits from the fishery have gone up, and they are now monitoring this every year. So there's stock assessments being done yearly, and we can see that this fishery, is sustainable and it is working. So some of the pressures in Poole Harbour have been reduced. But actually, if we look at the protected features, the habitats and species, at least under the SSSI rating, over half of them are in unfavourable or declining condition. And the reason for this is an external pressure. It's essentially pollution coming into the water. So it's agricultural runoff, phosphates and nitrates coming down the local rivers into the harbour and causing really poor water quality. So while some pressures in Poole Harbour are well managed, others really aren't. And what we really need is a sort of a joined up, wider governance approach to look at the surrounding areas as well. So while we've heard that, the surrounding areas for terrestrial areas, for terrestrial protected areas are important, they really are for marine protected areas as well. In terms of OECMs, well, we've already met the 30 by 30 target on paper, although obviously, as I say, we need more management measures in place for the protected areas. But other effective area conservation measures can be useful. Things like wind farms, which are, offshore wind's a huge priority now. Well, they tend to benefit things like fish stocks, and they tend to be a good place for marine mammals to, they tend to use them more than other places, but they could be improved even more. So we can look at things like artificial reefs, or even things like seaweed aquaculture there, and both of those would potentially boost biodiversity. And things like seaweed aquaculture could even help. It could even help sort of the local economy as well. Things like mussel farms can also boost biodiversity. Although the picture is actually from New Zealand, there's a good example of a rope mussel farm in Lyme Bay in Dorset and Devon, where again, fish biomass has gone up as a result. So we should be thinking about OECMs in the marine environment as well as just the protected areas. So overall, the area target has been met. There is an urgent need for management measures. As I say, the first measures in offshore areas are coming in, but that's really around fishing. Good examples of marine protected areas should work for people and nature, but we need to consider pressures more than just fishing as well. So we do need to consider particularly coastally pollution and development, and also the effect of climate change in these areas. And with that, I'm going to pass back to Damien.
Fantastic, thanks very much, Rick. We've another speaker coming up. Remember, keep asking your questions, please. The next speaker is another author of the report, Becky Turner. She's at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and the University of Kent. And Becky's going to tell us about how can area-based conservation effectively support nature's recovery. So over to you, Becky. Thank you.
Thanks, Damien. I'll just share my screen. Okay, hopefully that's popped up, everyone can see. Okay, so as you've just heard from Joe, Rick and Jane, protected areas are one of the most powerful tools available to us to safeguard the environment. But what needs to happen to make a network of protected areas the beating heart of nature's recovery in the UK? One of the biggest challenges faced in 30 by 30 is in finding the right balance between delivering positive outcomes for society whilst minimising negative outcomes for nature. So how can we determine which areas will support nature's recovery and should count towards the 30 by 30 target? For this report, the BES brought together a multidisciplinary team of researchers, and we surveyed the breadth of literature and consulted with a range of experts to identify which conservation measures support nature's recovery and should count towards the target. We found 3 key components of effective conservation measures. Firstly, that effective measures consider the environment and how it is used. Second, they consider the context between the interactions that happen between humans and nature. And they turn the lens on the behaviours and decisions of people and wildlife in these interactions. How and why do people interact with the environment? And where are there opportunities to drive positive outcomes for nature? The report emphasises that an effective network of protected areas should be developed with these considerations in mind. So how can we evaluate the effectiveness of our protected area network? In the report, we developed 4 criteria for effectiveness, which we refer to as the A, B, C, D criteria. To contribute to the target, areas must deliver for nature in the long term. They must build ecological resilience and improve biodiversity. They must achieve conservation outcomes by prioritizing evidence-based management and monitoring. And they must be developed and delivered inclusively. So let's examine these criteria a little closer. A, the area must deliver for nature in the long term. Nature must be protected against harm so that it can recover from damaging impacts, such as against pollution or habitat destruction or overexploitation. This includes removing or alleviating environmental pressures both inside and outside of the boundary of the site. The bottom line here is that the area must provide sustainable conditions for nature to thrive, both now and into the future. Effectiveness should be assessed by 2030, and where there is not enough data available, the area must be legally committed to actions that will result in long-term protection. B, a site must help to build ecological resilience and improve biodiversity. This is critical, as diverse land and seascapes deliver benefits for both wildlife and people, buffering against potentially negative consequences of rapid environmental change. For example, increasing biodiversity can lead to more carbon capture, and this is essential if we are to reduce the rates of climate change. To promote resilience, an effective protected area network must complement the needs of the wider ecosystem and therefore account for the areas between protected areas. The conservation objectives of protected areas and other conservation measures should therefore address the ongoing need for ecological resilience. C, conservation outcomes must be achieved by prioritizing evidence-based management and regular monitoring. A site must be managed to ensure it delivers its conservation outcomes. Having regular monitoring in place can inform long-term management. And this means we can keep track of the state of nature within areas and act accordingly to meet our conservation objectives. This is not a new concept, but will require substantial and sustained funding and resource. The final criterion, D, recommends that conservation measures are developed and delivered inclusively with local communities in partnership with landowners, NGOs, researchers, government agencies, and other stakeholders. Ultimately, nature's recovery and the effectiveness of a protected area network will be driven by people. This means we should embed co-designed strategies of governance to ensure that conservation goals and incentives from pro-environmental action are developed with local communities and partnerships. Other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs, are often bottom-up initiatives and are supported by local communities. These conservation measures will also play a role in nature's recovery and to the 30 by 30 target, if they can guarantee benefits for nature for the long term. Here is an example, excuse me. Here is an example of pro-environmental action on privately owned land, which is providing benefits to people and nature, and could be better recognised in the protected area network. Deer Park Farm is an example of a locally valued county wildlife site, and is also a profitable, nature-friendly working farm on the Devon-Cornwall border. The long-term owners place a strong emphasis on protecting the environment and engaging the public in environmental education. Since the owners bought the land 20 years ago, they have restored nearly 40 acres of previously neglected ancient grassland and hay meadows, which now supports over 1,100 species of plants and wildlife. Their hard work has improved biodiversity through planned management and monitoring, and the land now delivers for nature. Visitors to the site are encouraged to learn about sustainable farming and participate in wildlife-friendly activities. OECMs could be included in the 30% coverage of areas that are effective for nature if they provide evidence of long-term assurances for nature. But their role within the existing protected area network is still not clearly defined. The report emphasises that simply designating an area of land or sea does not automatically make it an effective area for nature, but this is nonetheless an important first step towards delivering wider ecological benefits. The report suggests that these criteria should be used to determine what a site must achieve to be counted towards 30 by 30, and how these sites can be supported by the wider network for the benefit of nature and people. I'll now pass back over to Damien and Joe. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Becky. That's fantastic. So what we're going to do is pass over to Joe in a moment for some concluding messages before we get properly into the Q&A. We're getting lots of good questions, so please keep those coming in. If you want it directed at a particular speaker, let me know. And also, if you can give your name and affiliation, that would be helpful. But I will just pass over now to Joe for some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Damien. We have lots of really committed people in the UK who work for nature organisations and care deeply about the species and habitats they manage. I'm sure some are perhaps in our audience today. So to ensure robust management, though, we need organisations and site management to have empowerment and information, for which the substantial and sustained resourcing is fundamental, that a few of us have spoken about. We've found considerable data gaps, which make it difficult to assess biodiversity trends inside and outside protected areas. Better resourcing of nature bodies would allow for robust monitoring to support future effective management, and we may want to align these with international standards. These resources would also enable nature bodies to engage with local stakeholders, including landowners and communities, towards collaborative and sustainable conservation efforts. Alongside this, we need to remember that 30 by 30 isn't in itself sufficient to ensure nature's recovery. Even if we reach 30%, then it's vital that the spaces in between protected areas are working towards those same goals, as I hope we've really tried to stress. That's why we need effective policies that support nature on land and in the seas outside protected areas, and a planning system that recognises not only the apparent economic value of an area, but its holistic value to society and the environment. There will be activities and schemes that are good for the overall nature network, but that cannot count towards 30 by 30. These might include places under relatively short-term environmental schemes where funds or uncertainties don't allow for longer-term commitments. Then individual people's efforts as well, where they live, also matter. Great positive actions that don't contribute to 30 by 30 remain extremely important. But overall, 30 by 30 is a fantastic opportunity to redefine our approach to nature conservation in the UK, but it will require significant efforts in the coming years to achieve it in a meaningful way. Any areas used towards the 30% must be delivering for nature by supporting species, habitats, and society in our changing world, and not just exist as lines on a map. And then finally, and on a slightly more personal note, I did just want to add that it's been a pleasure working with such a fantastic team of people on this important report. And with that, back to you, Damien.
Great. Well, thank you to all of our speakers, Joseph, Jane, Rick, and Becky, for that summary of the report, which is fascinating. I'm going to invoke Chair's privilege and ask a little question of my own before we get into the excellent questions that are coming in, and please do keep sending those. I think this is probably one for you, Joe, but one of the themes in the report is that the sort of lack of effectiveness of management or work for benefits for biodiversity was sort of lack of funding. And certainly I've reported over a long period of time, for example, with the Environment Agency, who are supposed to stop pollution, which Rick mentioned in Poole Harbour. They've lost half their staff, I think, and budgets have been cut pretty heavily too. On the other hand, the government has promised a £640 million scheme, which is called Nature for Climate Fund. So I sort of wonder, Joe, where you think we are with funding? Is it sort of in train? Do we still need to be appealing for more in order to make these things happen? What's your view of the sort of funding situation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on government funding, but what I do know from speaking to people is, and as I just mentioned in the conclusion there, we have a lot of really, really committed staff who work for nature organisations across the UK, who really want to do more. And even in our AONBs and national parks, for example, which were not designated originally for their biodiversity value, which is why we're calling for a repurposing of those. In those places, some fantastic biodiversity work is going on, but often they're under-resourced and can't necessarily do everything that they want or need to do. So yeah, we certainly need more resources for the organisations who are on the front line. And I noticed, I just flicked over to the Q&A, and this perhaps relates to one of the other questions as well. I'm just trying to remember exactly who it was. It was something to do with AONBs, I think, and it was to do with things like land ownership, essentially. So the authorities of some of these bigger protected areas, these protected landscapes, and they obviously don't own a lot of the land, but what they do have is really fantastic, or at least in my experience, they have really fantastic relationships with the landowners. So lots of these authorities who are under-resourced are extremely well placed to do good things if they have the resources they need, or at least that's my opinion, and that's what we've tried to communicate in the report, but I'm sure other authors might have a take on that as well.
Great, yeah, that was, you were referring to a question from Danny there, which was a good one. So listen, I'll get into some of the Q&A, and I'll start with one about management effectiveness. Perhaps Jane, you can take this up to start with, but the question's from James Robinson, who's the chair of the IUCN NCUK Protected Areas Working Group, and he says management effectiveness is clearly the greatest challenge for the UK's protected area network, and it's good to see this highlighted in the report. But did the authors form a view on what type of mechanism or tool would be needed to assess protected area management effectiveness, or could be adopted in the UK?
Sure. I mean, we already have a decent number of monitoring strategies in the UK, and I think I just mentioned briefly in the conclusion there that there is value to aligning these with international schemes as well to help with international reporting for our own protected areas. I know that so particularly in some of the sections Becky was involved with, we talked a little bit about monitoring, and we did explicitly refer to the protected area management effectiveness, didn't we, Becky? So I don't know if you wanted to come in there as well. Sorry to put you on the spotlight.
That's all right, Joe. So yeah, we did mention that. We thought it would be a useful auditing tool and a way to provide some of that baseline data to then move forwards and see how a site is delivering for nature in the long term. So yeah, a good suggestion of a tool there.
Great, thanks everybody. We'll go to another question. This one's from Julie Felix, who's a PhD student at Royal Holloway. Jane, I think this is about land, so maybe if you can take this one. He's asking, is it possible to improve protected areas without considering right to roam laws? He says people are being encouraged to spend more time outside, as they should, but this is increasing pressures on national parks with increased traffic and erosion, which could counteract any actions taken to improve biodiversity. So do we need more areas with public access to help alleviate these pressures? Jane, would you be okay to talk to that one?
Yeah, and I'll take that. I don't think the report talks about that specifically. I don't know whether Joe or Becky would disagree with that. And I guess the things that we have been discussing and presenting in the report is about the complexity and issues around deciding what to protect and where and who decides, and the fact that our landscapes need to deliver in multiple ways. And so recognizing that one area of land, once it's designated for nature, will not be available for delivering other things from our landscapes. And so thinking about how we decide and manage those landscapes to deliver for nature whilst also delivering for other things as well. And I guess the question is asking about the fact that people are part of our landscapes, and how do we ensure that nature can recover and exist side by side with things that people want to benefit from within the landscape, and that those are challenges that particular landscapes are going to have to work out how to manage, so that protected areas don't mean that people are excluded. I think that was a really important part of the report that the BES wanted to get across, is that people are part of landscapes and need to benefit from nature. So we need to understand how to manage issues where we understand that human disturbance can have problems for the biodiversity that is there. So yeah, a really good question, and a really challenging one, I think, for us to answer, especially because we know how much, well, we've all benefited hugely from being able to have access to green space, which has led a lot to problems with disturbance and so on. I don't know if you wanted to say something more about that, Joe, and come in there.
Actually, to be honest, Jane, if you don't mind, actually, I think we move on, because we're just getting a lot of questions here, and it would be good to try and reflect as many of those as possible. So the next one I've got is for Becky, and there's quite a theme in the questions around the idea that, you know, for example, in national parks, not a lot of the land is owned by, you know, conservation organisations, and also about the role of people within those. And I know that inclusivity was a really important part of the research. So this is a question from Anne Humble, who is at Welsh Government ERA, and she said, Becky, what sort of themes of people's behaviour do you have in mind when you're talking about people and their interaction with the protected site? And says that climate change is gearing up for a big effort in behaviour change. Ideally, we'd want to include tackling the nature crisis in this engagement. So what kind of things are you thinking about in terms of what people could do or how they might interact?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, really good question. So I guess it just boils down to understanding the context of why people are engaging with the environment. What's driving the interactions here? Is it a need for building livelihood? Is it for recreation? Is it for mental health purposes? We don't have much evidence about why people interact with nature the way they do in ecology. Environmental psychology is an emerging field, and it's creating lots of good insights, but we really need more research using some social science methods in research to kind of get to the heart about what drives people to interact with nature in the way they do. And by doing that, you can understand where some of the barriers might be for uptake of different schemes and initiatives in conservation. Simply by asking landowners, what area of your land would you be willing to put aside for nature, and what's stopping you doing that so far, can really provide insights that we wouldn't have otherwise recognized. So it's just really about trying to understand what's driving the human nature interface.
Great, thank you for that. Got a question, or a couple of questions really, for Rick next. An anonymous attendee was talking about how there were fascinating examples you mentioned about OECM, those other effective conservation mechanisms in the marine environment, wind farms and mussel farms. But also Kate Jennings, who is Head of Sites and Species Policy at RSPB, was talking about the potential for sort of conflict here as well, in that offshore wind farms, Kate says, can be massively detrimental in places. So the question, if I can combine them really, is you know, how do you sort of approach that potential tension? How do you handle that tension when there are sort of potential opposing impacts of things like wind farms or even mussel farms, I guess. So Rick, yeah, if you could take that, thank you.
Yeah, I think it falls under a sort of a broad category which we try to deal with throughout the report as well. That there isn't one measure that necessarily you can apply to every single protected area, whether that's marine or not, other than obviously the sort of the broader principles which Becky has outlined. So it is about making sure there's buy-in essentially from a whole host of stakeholders. So with wind farms and birds, obviously putting the wind farms in the wrong place is very detrimental to seabirds, and it's really important that people like the RSPB and conservation organisations have a say in where those wind farms are, where they're put, so it minimises that minimises that impact. I think in terms of how you get the public on board, again, I mean, I'm sat here in Poole, and we've had a disastrous attempt to put an offshore wind farm in place, which has had all sorts of opposition and was thrown out a few years ago. But it is about getting the local community on board. You know, at the moment, I mean, this goes beyond what we say in the report. Obviously, we've got soaring energy prices at the moment. If people who have wind farms nearby have lower energy prices, I think the situation will begin to change. So it's about bringing in the local community and making sure there are benefits. Now, again, things like co-location of seaweeds, it should bring in jobs to the local community. So it's about that planning stage and really getting everybody on board and having conservation organisations, having members of the local community express opinions and really come to that consensus that yes, this should be a protected area or this should be a good site for a wind farm.
Great, yeah, thank you, Rick. That's fantastic. Where shall I go next? I've got so many questions. I will go to this one from Sarah Meller next. And she asked, maybe Joseph can take this one. Do the authors have any thoughts on what additional mechanisms need to be made available to the managers of protected areas to help release lands for long-term nature conservation? Are you able to pick that up, Joe?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a little bit of a go at that. I'm just wondering where to start with it. So one of the experiences we had during this, as Becky mentioned there, is we were interviewing a lot of what we called contributors. So for example, I spoke to one landowner who's a farmer down in Cranning Chase, AONB, someone I knew before this process started as well. And I was talking to him a little bit about freeing up land for nature conservation. So he's already quite a nature-friendly farmer, and he does have things like wildflower strips and things on the edges of the land, which have benefits for insects and a wider ecosystem. But we spoke about the longevity of some of the schemes that farmers can sign up to. And one of the things I really took away from that conversation is that some landowners and farmers won't want to sign up to schemes that are very long-term. And that's because of all kinds of uncertainties, partly relating to the B word of Brexit, but also things like climate change and the economy and what they can sell things for and what they might need the land for in 5 or 10 years' time. So there is a slight mismatch there in that, on the one hand, for something to be able to count as part of our criteria, it has to have some kind of longevity, okay? Because nature takes a long time to recover, and we need time to see that change happening. So you can't just have like a 3-year agri-environment scheme and say, yeah, that counts towards 30 by 30, because that's not long-term enough to be confident that nature will benefit. However, if there's more of a coordinated landscape approach that does look a little bit further into the future, that might not necessarily mean one farmer has to commit a large portion of land to something for a long period of time, but it's more of a landscape approach, looking decades ahead, then that kind of thing could work really well and could, related to what Becky was saying with her case study there, could count towards 30 by 30. I don't know if anyone else, or it's over to you, Damien, but if anyone else wanted to come in.
We have some more questions on sort of similar themes, so I'll come back to those. But so the next one I want to ask actually is, not quite sure who picked this up, so maybe I can ask for a volunteer, possibly Becky, but we'll see. It's from Caroline Bowen, and it's to do with the planning system. So it says, has any research been done into how the planning system has contributed or not contributed to biodiversity recovery? Whilst England has introduced biodiversity net gain, the actual process still appears, Caroline says, to be less about biodiversity and more about not holding up development. Is it time for a paradigm shift in the UK planning system to address this imbalance? That's from Caroline Bowen. So does anyone want to put their hand up for that? Sorry, what do you think?
Happy, it's Jane here,
okay, Jane.
I'm happy.
Yeah, you can take that. Great.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really great question, because I think what we're seeing here is the government making ambitious commitments, which then have to be followed up so that they turn into reality that is effective. And I guess one of the things, I mean, speaking personally, one of the things that wasn't considered in the report, but speaking personally, I mean, we've had protected areas, you know, for a century, and it's really important that they deliver. You could argue that we've had protected areas and they haven't delivered for nature. So what is going to be new now by having more protected areas? And so I think an important message from the report is that we support the ambition, and it now needs to deliver so it does actually help nature to recover. So things like the Environment Bill's commitments and the biodiversity net gain are great, but the devil will be in the detail. What will they actually return in terms of being able to show in 10 years' time or whatever that there has been a positive benefit for biodiversity in those locations where biodiversity has declined? And I think the other issue around the things to do with biodiversity net gain and planning and so on, there's some potential opportunities for bringing in private finance as well, if given that many organisations and many companies are making their own ambitious commitments to nature recovery and recognising that the activities that their companies are carrying out, they want to ensure are not having detrimental impacts on nature. So there are potentially opportunities in that way in which funding and initiatives will be driven by the private sector as well.
Fantastic, thank you, Jane. Another question, this one from Tess Colley, who's from the ENDS report. And I'm going to suggest maybe, Joe, you might want to pick this up, but again, someone put their hand up if they want to. So the question from Tess is, DEFRA's Nature Recovery Green Paper moots that all current protected sites could be merged into, quotes, a simpler legal structure, arguing that such reforms could enable nature's recovery through, again, quote, a less prescriptive system. So what do people think of these proposals of simplification? Could it work to help reach 2030? And I think it's certainly true for outsiders, and I'm a little bit of one of those. There's certainly a bewildering number of different designations. So I don't know, Joe, will you be able to pick that up?
I'm happy to start on that if you like.
Okay, sorry, Rick, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, the government's put out a lot of indicators at the moment, and actually, you know, it fits in a little bit with what Jane has just said as well. You know, there is a commitment to end biodiversity loss by 2030 and reverse it, and the same with actually the changes in designations, and it makes complete sense, as you know, as you just said, Damien, and I think probably certainly what we felt when we started the report, I'm speaking personally anyway, there's so many different protected site designations that it gets really confusing. So it makes sense at a broad level. The problem is always in the details here, and we don't yet know the details of what those new site designations would be. I think we would need a lot more detail as ecologists to really understand what's going on. You know, even things like biodiversity net gain. I think there's probably, I'm guessing there's a huge number of ecologists in the audience at the moment, and we have a clear understanding of what biodiversity is, and that isn't necessarily what's measured by those biodiversity tools. So again, there's a huge amount of unpicking of the detail that we really need to know before we can actually say if this is going to work. I think that's probably the biggest sort of message from a lot of the proposals at the moment. They sound very sensible, but we just need to have that bit of caution.
Okay, thank you for that. A question next from Tim Graham, and I think, unless I've misinterpreted the question, it seems to be sort of the opposite thing, which is rather than simplifying, maybe there are some other designations that would be useful. So Tim asks, just thinking about the current nature recovery green paper consultation, does the report examine what future nature recovery designations we require and how they may operate? So, I mean, I guess both of the questions actually are really asking is does what exists at the present time kind of work? You know, I don't know, does somebody want to suggest that, talk about that rather?
I can do, yeah. I mean, one of the proposals for designations is sort of mirroring what they're proposing in the marine environment. So there will be some highly protected marine areas designated where basically fishing won't be allowed. And whether or not we just look at highly protected and slightly lesser protected areas has been one of the sort of proposals for terrestrial systems as well. We do need highly protected marine areas. There is definitely a case for having no fishing in some areas of the sea. So I think that's important. Whether that really, again, without knowing the full details of how those designations are going to be applied to land, I think it's difficult to say. I know that's almost the same answer.
That's all right. I think, Joe, you were going to mention something. Just before I come to you, Alistair's asked a sort of related question. In his view, he says that isn't it the case that our protected area system is overly complex? He says funding has always been the issue, and what is often missed is the practicalities of training and retaining highly skilled wardens and rangers who are able to focus and manage on these sites for the long term. So Alistair's view is surely if we simplified the system, it would help with costs and allow for more efficient and better funded management. So what's your take on this, Joseph?
Well, I mean, to some extent, it sounds like Alistair might be more knowledgeable.
I think you're on mute.
Oh, no.
You're back now.
Okay, sorry, I did unmute. I was just saying it from the question, it sounds like Alistair might also almost know more about that than I do to some extent. I mean, for me, I think what we need is we need some areas, like Rick was just saying for marine, we need some areas that have a very, very high level of protection for biodiversity. And then almost imagine it as concentric circles almost, you know, some areas that protect nature quite well, but allow a lot of human activities, and then areas that have lower protection as well. And for me, it's more about effectiveness. I don't necessarily want to comment on the range of designations that we have. I agree it can be a bit confusing, and perhaps simplification could help, but I'd probably much rather see effective designations rather than worrying too much about the structure. But if a restructuring would help, and there was a clear roadmap, and it wasn't just what's the phrase, it just wasn't kind of tweaking for the sake of it, then yeah, fine. But it's the effectiveness that really matters to me, and having these highly protected areas supported by other less protected areas where people can do their thing.
Okay, great. So a question, actually this is the second one from Anne Humble at the Welsh Government, but she makes an important point, which is that of course a lot of the mechanisms referred to in the reports only apply to England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, all have tackling these issues in different ways. And I think it would be interesting to hear a bit about the sort of diversity of approaches, if there is such a thing in the or the parts of the different parts of the United Kingdom, whether some are doing better than others. I don't know. Becky, I think you kind of had an overview about some of these things. Would you be okay to talk to that a little bit, or does somebody else want to have a go?
I can start us off, but please do jump in, everybody else, if you would like. I think what we're trying to get across in the report is that we're pulling together lots of different lines of thinking from all over the UK, but a common thread here is that when we've got integrated approaches, these tend to work better. So whilst each area might do things slightly differently. There's a lot we can learn. So having some kind of mechanism to think about an integrated system for governance and decision making, I think, is something that applies across the UK. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I could say a little bit if you like. I mean, I think to some extent, because DEFRA have put out so much at the moment, some of the examples we're probably using today and some of what we've been talking about a little bit English focused. However, when we actually put the report together within our steering committee, we had representatives from Scotland or Wales. So we certainly took into account, and I don't think the report is particularly biased towards England. I think it's quite general across the whole of the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Damien, can I just mention as well, we do also note in the report the importance of coordination between the 4 nations as well. It's no good just having a really good protected area on one side of the border and something that's not working quite so well on the other side, or perhaps even negatively impacting the protected area on the other side of the border. We talk about these external pressures. So that coordination between the 4 nations is really important, and we do talk about that in the report. Sorry.
No problem, that's great. Thanks, everybody. A couple of people have asked about the next question. So the first was James Hall, who's at Lancashire Wildlife Trust. This is a question for Jane. So James asked, did the report look at the new statutory local nature recovery strategies in regards to connectivity? He's particularly interested in reviews of the Greater Manchester LNRS pilot. Meg Griffiths, who's at the Plant Life Policy team, was also asking about the local nature recovery strategies and its connection to connectivity, which of course you mentioned in answering an earlier question, Jane. But were you able to look at that, and what did you make of it?
Yes, the report does talk about those local strategies and talks about mechanisms by which they would operate to deliver nature recovery across the landscape. So the one of the boxes in the report, the example there is for a site in eastern England, but the concepts from those would apply broadly. And I know there's been a number of pilots testing that those approaches. So yeah, these look. I guess depending on what the outcomes of some of those pilots will be, these look like great ways of bringing communities together to make decisions about what they want their landscapes to deliver and how they will end up being effective. And of course, as part of that, there has to be agreements on what the outcomes are wished to be and what evidence is needed to determine whether those outcomes have been achieved. So a key finding from the report was the importance of setting baselines and targets for what we want to achieve, and thinking about who decides and what that is. And I guess coming back to this concept of biodiversity, which we've already talked about, everyone in all the ecologists in the audience will completely understand that. I mean, biodiversity, we all get it, but when we all start to try and work out how we're going to measure it, then it becomes incredibly complicated. And that's part of the reason that the report found it quite difficult, I think, to find evidence of the benefits, the current benefits of protected areas, because people measure different things in different ways, and it's hard to draw out general patterns. So there are huge challenges in working out what is biodiversity and how do we measure its recovery.
Great, thank you, Jane. Another question, and this is good because it gets into sort of a sort of specific example, I think, and some of the challenges. It's from Karen Baxter, who's at DEFRA and the Environment Agency. So Karen says, within the East Devon AONB area, we're working on the Lower Otter Restoration Project, which will create 55 hectares of salt marsh and mudflat, plus a net gain in woodland and hedgerow She also mentions they're working alongside a sister project in Normandy, creating another 45 hectares of wetland. And as I know from my own reporting, wetland is some of the most endangered type of habitat. But Karen says it can be a hard slog selling the nature benefits to local residents at times, because they see the work progressing as we've had to remove trees in order to get this going. So I guess the question is, you know, how do we get these bigger projects going and carry the local people alongside them? Does anyone want to volunteer for that one? I'm going to have to pick somebody.
I can try quickly. I mean, about a year ago, we had a report on nature-based solutions, and one of the key messages from that is, you know, nature-based solutions aren't just about planting trees, and it's a hard message to get across, because we always hear about tree planting, and you know, there are cases where we need to remove trees. There's cases for, you know, there's carbon benefits of removing trees in some habitats. I don't necessarily have the easy answer of how to get that across, other than I think we need to keep that message up, that we need a diverse range of habitats for biodiversity and for carbon storage. And it isn't just about trees. Trees can be great in some places, and you know, I'm certainly not suggesting we chop down every tree by any means. You know, definitely not saying that. But yeah, in some cases they're in the wrong places.
Joe, did you want to say something? I thought you were.
Yeah, I did unmute, but that was a really nice introduction to it. And actually, in the question, it had a couple of places that are on my list of places to visit as well. So I do hope to see those places one day, because yeah, some really fantastic work. We talk quite a lot in the report about involving people and giving people agency over decisions that are being made. Something came up in relation to this with farmland as well, and I don't know. We might end up, I don't know if the questions cover this, but there was some stuff about rewilding, for example, in one of the interviews that came up with one of the contributors, where they were saying that actually a lot of landowners and farmers are reluctant to some extent to give land back to nature, because they've spent generations getting it in the state it's in and working that land. And that's been a huge amount of effort. So there's some hesitancy from that angle, as well as these local hesitancies for people not wanting to chop down specific trees and so on. With those local efforts, though, we've spoken a lot, and it's our D in our 4 criteria. D, developed and delivered inclusively. So I think really it's just what we found in our evidence is conservation projects that work really well, as I'm sure the person who asked the question knows probably better than me, is involving people from the start and having those consultation stages, just so that everyone knows what's going on, so that suddenly a load of what might seem like quite destructive activity is happening. So perhaps, I don't know, Becky, or Damien wants to pass over to Becky for the criteria, but yeah, that's my view.
Yeah, Becky, tell us about that.
I was just going to reiterate that, Joe, just being able to involve people right from the start is really powerful. And AONBs as well are in a really good position to bring landowners and locals in early, and they've got good governance structures in place to really try and roll out conservation initiatives at quite a large scale. So yeah, if we can start getting people involved right at the start, I think that's the best place to start. So.
Okay, great. I've got another question here. So this is for Rick in particular, and it's from Aurora Hood, who is at the local nature partnerships in Cymru, Wales. She says, what kind of first step policy recommendations can you suggest for getting marine protected areas on the agenda of local governments? How do we strike a balance between marine and terrestrial priorities? Aurora says that in her experience, it seems like more attention and funding tends to go towards terrestrial conservation, even though so many local communities are heavily reliant on the sea. So, you know, is it a bit more difficult to get people to get interested in back protected areas offshore or off the coast?
It can be, yeah. And one of the issues that we face in the UK is the vast majority of people don't think anything lives in the sea of the UK, and it's not true at all. It's, as I'm sure you know, the vast majority of people here are aware. You know, it's a very diverse ecosystem. I guess again, in terms of getting on the agendas of local governments, we need to look at the win-win situations which you can get from protected areas. Biodiversity is going to be, is really important, but there's also things like that. Potentially you get higher, more profitable fisheries, which could help sort of improve the local community. We can also look at things like climate adaptation effects. If we're restoring or allowing kelp forests and seagrass and things to recover, then actually it's going to reduce potential storm action and things that will hit some of those places. Certainly some of the things you see in Aberystwyth, for example. I don't know if there's potential for kelp forests off there, but you certainly see storm damage there, every year. So I guess it's looking at those win-win benefits of having those protected areas and having the right nature out there. And when you start looking at all that together, it should be of interest to local governments.
Great, thank you, Rick. So we've got a question from a farmer, which of course is a really important constituency in everything that we've been discussing today. He or she doesn't give their name, but the question is, why don't all conservationists do more to work with farmers? And he or she says, we have a great connection to their wildlife and land. I'm told DEFRA believes rewarding farmers with 70% of the cost of the work involved in their scheme shows value for money. As a small family farmer who employs contractors, I can't afford to join the schemes unless it's for a part payment for the work I'm already doing. He or she says working with farmers is far cheaper than buying and managing land. But this person also says, I get no benefit from being in an AONB with the National Trust and Wildlife Trust as neighbours, but we've always worked with nature and left wild and quiet areas. Increasing uninvited access is trashing them. So that's a perspective from a farmer, and obviously 70% of the UK is farmland, I believe. So I wonder, Joseph, I could start with you, because you talked about the sort of different interactions you had, the discussions you had with people in terms of putting forward also putting together the material for the report. So what was the sort of feeling from the farming sector in terms of how to better protect nature? What were their concerns that came through in the report?
Yeah, I'm happy to start things off with this, but hopefully others can come in as well. I think it relates slightly back to what I was, there are so many directions we could go in here, and I think it's a really interesting question, and I'd actually really like to speak to that person more as well, because I think that's how we make the most out of our land, right? Land is a finite resource. We can only use one bit of land in a limited number of ways in a certain time period. So we need to be doing that as well as we can, and we need to be incentivizing environmentally beneficial behaviours and perhaps penalising bad ones sometimes as well, but let's not go down there yet. And what I said in my conclusion earlier is I was talking about making sure that the true value of land is reflected when we're thinking about a parcel of land. It's not necessarily just the economic output from the crop that's grown there or the animals that are produced there. It's also thinking about that land in a lot of other ways in terms of how it's benefiting people through ecosystem services. And Rick mentioned the nature-based solutions report that he led earlier. So I think it comes down to that, for one, is making sure that we have a value for the land and that people are rewarded accordingly. If they're doing environmentally beneficial things, they should be rewarded for that. If they're not doing environmentally beneficial things but want to, then we need good schemes in place that allow that. And that really comes down to a lot of the resourcing we were talking about. I think, did you say, Damien, that the person who asked the question is in an AONB? Did you say that?
Yes, that's right, yeah. So it is a she, I am told, and they said they didn't get any benefit from being in an AONB and having as neighbours the National Trust and Wildlife Trust.
Yeah, so that slightly reflects a conversation I had with a friend of mine who's down in Cranbourne Chase AONB, who actually, they didn't really have a lot to say about the fact they were in an AONB. It didn't make a lot of tangible difference, really. So yeah, if we're taking protected areas seriously, and if we do repurpose our protected landscapes like national parks and AONBs to bring nature up the agenda slightly while still supporting communities and people who work on the land, then yeah, if we're taking nature seriously, people should be given the resources they need to make their farm more nature friendly.
Yeah, that's great. So Danny's sort of reflected on this. She doesn't say where she works, but says that farmers I have worked with have always welcomed schemes that they understand, and says that she feels that some policies are announced before groundwork is done with communities and agricultural workers, which starts a fearful reaction, starts people on the ground, putting them on the back foot, trying to engage with those communities. And there was another question about rewilding. Let me just find that. Again, doesn't say who it's from, but this person says the concept of rewilding can be very threatening to those who have managed the land for generations and see themselves as stewards of the land. They may see rewilding as an abandonment of both the land and their duty. I think, Jane, did you mention rewilding when you were talking before? Certainly, as a journalist, it's a topic which grabs a lot of people's attention, both sort of positively, mostly positively, to be honest, a little bit negatively. Some people worry about, food supplies and things like that. But I sort of wonder, there's sort of two things there, Jane. One is, the scheme's too complicated that come in. Elms has taken a long time. There's still a lot of uncertainty for farmers there, I think, that we're seeing. And also maybe talk a little bit about rewilding and whether, is it a branding problem, or I don't know, is there sort of, what are the issues around that as far as, using that method or idea towards increasing biodiversity?
Yeah, so there's some really great questions and problems and challenges here, and I guess with all of those questions, there are issues about the really key challenges that we need to address immediately, which is about food, climate change, and nature recovery. And clearly, going back to a comment that Joe made, then parts of our landscape can generally deliver only on one of those, and the question is about how to make sure across the landscape that we're delivering on all of those, and that there are win-win situations where different initiatives can combine and produce added benefits rather than contrast and be detrimental. And so I guess the issue about where to plant trees, where to grow crops, and where nature can thrive are really difficult questions to answer, and for which we need to be aware of what the pros and cons are. So coming back to the farming, I guess from the farming issue, there are some examples of how there could be opportunities there as our diets change, and there are different demands for thinking about the lowering of meat diets and so on, but recognizing that those decisions about what to farm and where can change quite quickly, and Joe's point about the degree to which agri-environment schemes can't count because they're quite short in terms of the changes that might come about. So the thinking about how our landscapes deliver and help us with all of those challenges is key, and is rewilding part of that? Well, all the ecologists on this call will know that rewilding means many different things to many different people, and obviously for farmers there are concerns about what changes to their farms might be in terms of what this rewilding would be. I suppose personally I would bring it back to questions about what species do we want to reintroduce and where, which I completely understand is not what most people may think about rewilding, but we do have opportunities to enhance biodiversity in locations by physically moving or introducing species if we wish, and thinking about how we decide about what that might be, and recognizing that nature recovery involves the recovery of ecosystems as well as individual target species that we may choose to focus on. So really interesting question, and a huge complexity there, which I feel I've probably only just lightly touched on.
You did a great job, Jane. Thank you for that. So listen, we're almost out of time. Any last questions? You're going to have to get them in now if you want them to be answered. I'm just going to do a little connecting here. So Joseph, I think the farmer whose comments I read out earlier is keen to get in touch. If you wouldn't mind posting an email address in the Q&A, she asks that, so that would be good. I think it's worth, there's a sort of more of a comment than a question, but from Jeanette Hall, which I think is interesting. So she says, a colleague and I worked with farmers on the Black Isle to improve habitat for great crested newts. The farmers were really proud of their land and their management of it and very happy to give up areas for pond creation, but they didn't want anything to do with the land management schemes because they found them horribly complicated and stressful. We were able to carry out the work without bureaucracy because of a dedicated grant, and the farmers were delighted, but we need to accept that grant schemes need to be appropriate for the people managing the land. I mean, I saw you nodding to that, Jane. Is it a problem that some of these management schemes can be very complicated, and grants might be a sort of an additional or a better way to go about these things?
You know, I think that's a really positive example.
I think you're on mute, or at least it hasn't caught up.
Oh,
you're back now, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's a really positive example from Jeanette, so that's great. And I think there is a concern. It comes back to a question that was asked before about the complexity of protection. And I guess one of the issues there is the degree to which, and there'll be other people who'd be better to answer this, is the degree to which that complexity is necessary for governance reasons. And I guess quite a lot of our discussion, at least from my perspective, has been focusing on management on a particular site or within a particular area. And of course, what a lot of management will require is stopping bad things from outside the protected area from having an impact on that protected area. And when we're thinking about management and governance, some of that complexity around the designation might be needed in order for there to be strength in that protection to prevent detrimental impacts from outside the protected area. But as I say, I completely understand about that complexity and difficulty of stakeholders engaging, and we'd need to balance the governance, the protection, with people feeling confident to sign up.
Brilliant. Well, listen, I'm afraid that we are out of time, but I will hand over to Yadvinder Mali, the BES president, in just a moment. I will say thank you very much to the four authors who've been brilliant at talking about their work and answering questions. And thank you very much as well, of course, to everyone who's asked the questions. I'm sorry if I didn't quite manage to get to everybody's, but I hope we covered a lot of it. I found it fascinating. I hope you did too, and it's been a great pleasure to be here. So thank you for that. And with that, I will hand over to Yadvinder for the closing remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Damien. Yes, well, what a fascinating discussion. And I hope all our audience has found the discussion and presentations as insightful and important as I have. I truly believe this report will be landmark in providing an evidence base to inform and help shape the realization of the 30 by 30 target. Of particular importance are the criteria that area-based conservation measures need to meet in order to be considered effective for nature. And we currently have an opportunity, and now is the time to really be ambitious here. I'm excited to see where it takes us in helping nature recover in the UK and building resilience for the future of biodiversity. So thank you, Damien, for chairing our launch event. You've been fantastic and helping to probe the complexity of achieving this 30 by 30 target and help make this such an informative and enjoyable event. So we're very grateful to you for your time. And a huge thank you to all of the excellent speakers at this event for their fascinating talks. And finally, to all the other authors of this report for giving their time and their contributions, assessing the available evidence and putting this comprehensive review together. So let's now see your efforts lead to real impetus in the UK to take a full advantage of what nature, protected and restored, can do for our society and our world. And a special thanks to all of you in the audience for watching and for participating. We hope you've really enjoyed this event. And the full report and much more besides, from videos to summaries for everyone, are now to be found on the BES website, and we'll put a link in the chat for you. I really recommend that you go and now download and read the report, as well as being rich in insight. It's also beautifully laid out and has some lovely graphics and detailed case studies. And the report will remain there on the website and also be permanently stored in our new open access platform, Applied Ecology Resources, in due course. So do let us know if you have any feedback on the report or on this event. And thank you all for joining us, and goodbye from the British Ecological Society.